Well, an ancient discovery is shedding light on the early church.
Buried beneath centuries of silence, a forgotten church near the Sea of Galilee has just whispered something extraordinary. What the archaeologists uncovered isn't just another artifact. It's a message so precise, so unexpected, that it may upend what millions thought they knew about a certain fisherman-turned-apostle. Not in Rome, not in theory, but in the soil where it all began. This isn't about relics or ruins. It's about authority, legacy, and a title chiseled into stone before history split the church in two. What was hidden for 1,500 years has resurfaced, and its timing is no accident. The moment of discovery. In the summer of 2022, on the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee, a team of archaeologists led by Professor Mordecai Avium of Kinneret Academic College and Dr. Stephen Notley of Nyack College made a discovery that would reverberate far beyond the dusty dig site at El Araj. This site had been under investigation for years as a potential candidate for the lost biblical town of Bethsaida, long associated with the apostles Peter, Andrew, and Philip. During their excavation of a Byzantine-era church buried beneath centuries of mud and debris, the team uncovered an extraordinary Greek mosaic.
When I heard about this mosaic and read the story behind it, I got the same kind of chills and the same kind of goosebumps.
It was not just the age of the artifact that stunned them, it was the remarkable state of preservation and the weight of its message. The mosaic was found embedded in the diaconicon, a sacristy chamber of the church typically reserved for liturgical preparations. Despite being buried for approximately 1,500 years, the floor had retained vivid clarity. The tesserae, tiny stone tiles forming the mosaic, remained intact, their geometric framing still elegant, and their Greek letters strikingly sharp. Most remarkable was the inscription's legibility. It appeared almost untouched by time. The text made direct reference to Peter, identifying him not just as a disciple, but as the chief of the apostles and holder of the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The phrasing was not generic or symbolic, but rooted in deeply theological language that mirrored scriptural texts. The reaction of the academic world was both immediate and intense. Top scholars in biblical archaeology and the study of early Christianity came forth, some with caution, others enthusiastically. Here, for Avium and Notley, who had conjectured about the significant importance of this location before, this floor mosaic acted as both confirmation and generator, since it was neither meant merely for decoration, but for dogmatic purposes, thus calling for new discussions concerning early Christian belief in the Galilee and its material manifestations. The excavation team members described the experience as filled with moments of awe reserved for moments in life when their goosebumps could find no precedence. The phrasing is particularly fitting, for ancient words in stone have cut centuries of theological silence into two. Even seasoned archaeologists, it seems, were overwhelmed by this notion of the clarity and location of the mosaic. Immediately, the discovery created a site of relevance for an inscription that specifies worship of Peter dating back 1,500 years. It connected the place with scriptural stories in a fashion not often achieved by biblical archaeology. It was no generic church mosaic proclaiming faith. It was a theological statement frozen in time, perhaps made by faithful believers who perceived El Araj as hallowed ground. This was more than a dissemination of historical information. It became a bridge between textual tradition and tangible memory, thus rekindling global interest in a quiet patch of earth that possibly once knew the stamp of apostolic footsteps with its accompaniment of Galilean soils. And just when the inscription seemed to say it all, a deeper question emerged. What if the ground it was found on held an even older secret? The long-lost village. For centuries, the true location of Bethsaida, the New Testament town linked to the apostles Peter, Andrew, and Philip, has been one of the most persistent mysteries in biblical archaeology. Mentioned multiple times in the Gospels, Bethsaida is described as a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee, yet its precise whereabouts were lost to time. Pilgrims and scholars from the Middle Ages onward tried to identify its site, but no consensus formed. The terrain had changed, the shoreline had shifted, and centuries of sediment concealed any obvious ruins. The lack of definitive archaeological evidence meant that Bethsaida existed more in theory than on the map, frustrating those eager to connect sacred text with physical terrain. For much of the 20th century, the leading candidate for Bethsaida's location was Et Tel, a prominent mound approximately 2 kilometers inland from the Sea of Galilee. While Et Tel yielded impressive Iron Age remains, including a city gate and large buildings, it lacked concrete evidence of a thriving fishing village from the 1st century, the time of Jesus and the apostles. Most critically, its distance from the water posed a serious challenge to the gospel description of Bethsaida as a place where fishermen lived and worked. Efforts to reconcile this with the biblical account led to speculative theories about ancient water levels, none of which were universally accepted. As a result, Et Tel's candidacy, though once widely supported, grew increasingly tenuous. In contrast, El Araj, a site close to the northern shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, has gained more importance over the last few decades. Excavations carried out by archaeologists from Kinneret Academic College and Nyack College confirmed an extended sequence of occupation from the Roman through the Byzantine period. Most impressive were the artifacts of the Roman 1st century coins, fishing implements, and pottery that clearly indicated the site's operation during the time of Jesus. In contrast to Et Tel, El Araj has also yielded trace evidence of the ruins of a Byzantine church, marking a long-standing Christian memory regarding the site. With its natural advantages for fishing and access to water, El Araj swiftly prioritized even more as a credible contender for identity with ancient Bethsaida. The solution to the puzzle of Bethsaida's location is more than a settlement of the academic debate. It is a reconfiguration of our understanding of the geography of the Gospels. Should this site be the one, it has gone on to deepen New Testament passages concerning Peter and Andrew, since they will mention a specific location that can be verified. Also, this would serve to bolster the correspondence between archaeological strata and biblical events, consolidating the assertion that these were real people present in real places and not merely abstract figures in spiritual literature. By recovering Bethsaida, perhaps scholars have reclaimed an important piece of the map of the historical Jesus. The inscription's theology. The Greek inscription discovered at El Araj stands out not only for its preservation, but for the precision and weight of its language. Carved into the mosaic floor of what appears to be the church's sacristy, the text reads with clarity uncommon in ancient artifacts of its kind. It refers to Peter as chief and commander of the heavenly apostles and includes a plea for intercession. Saint Peter, intercede for him and his children. The donor is named as Constantine, identified as a servant of Christ, suggesting the inscription commemorated a personal act of devotion. The wording itself, formal and theologically loaded, indicates a ritual or liturgical context rather than casual or decorative purposes. Its tone and structure reflect deliberate choices meant for communal worship or spiritual reflection. When compared to scriptural texts, the parallels become striking. The phrase, "holder of the keys to the kingdom of heaven," clearly echoes Matthew chapter 16:19, where Jesus says to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." This is further linked to Isaiah 22:22, where the symbolic act of granting authority through keys is associated with the stewardship of dynastic power. Although the mosaic does not quote these verses directly, the use of this language indicates that the inscription was rooted in scriptural tradition. The invocation of Peter's authority was not improvised, but connected to well-established biblical themes. This scriptural alignment enhances the credibility of the inscription as a liturgical expression rather than a general statement of veneration. The very structure of this mosaic inscription suggests that it is presented with a circular geometric border. Such designs were extensively used in Byzantine church mosaics, which served to frame texts or dedicatory inscriptions of a sacred nature. The inscription is succinct and formal, without narrative elaboration, characteristic of any inscription found in ecclesiastical settings. Its brevity, combined with the names, requests for intercession, and titles, falls readily within examples of dedicatory texts found in early Christian churches. These texts invariably served the twin purposes of honoring a saint and recording the pious acts of those patrons who financed the construction or decoration of such sacred spaces. By formally invoking Peter in an intercessionary request from the donors, the mosaic firmly fits within that tradition. What sets this mosaic apart from many others in churches is that its audience is so distinct. Whereas many church floors built during Byzantine times may have included blessings, symbolic animals, or abstract expressions of faith, the El Araj inscription combines personal devotion, ecclesiastical titles of the finest order, and scriptural references within one short sentence. It is neither merely abstract nor simply symbolic in terms of decorative choice. Instead, in fact, it seems to reflect a deliberately articulated theological vocabulary embedded in a liturgical setting directed to a named and titled apostolic figure, Peter. The result is a mosaic that confers clarity, intent, and reverence, expressed in a few tightly composed lines. The church itself. The Byzantine church unearthed at El Araj is not only a remarkable example of early Christian architecture, but also a living document of historical memory preserved in stone. Its design and spatial arrangement reflect both liturgical function and practical use, suggesting it was more than a place of worship. It was a center of spiritual hospitality. The most striking feature uncovered was the mosaic-laden diaconicon, a side chamber typically used in Byzantine churches for storing liturgical objects and preparing the Eucharist. It was in this space that the now famous Greek inscription honoring Peter was found. The positioning of such a significant message within the diaconicon underscores its sacred function and indicates the church's dedication to the apostolic legacy of Peter. Beyond the sanctuary and liturgical spaces, the archaeological team also uncovered evidence of a Roman-style bathhouse adjacent to the main structure. The bathhouse, with its telltale signs of heated floors and water channels, would have served hygienic and possibly communal roles for the clergy or pilgrims. This feature reflects the integration of Roman engineering into Byzantine ecclesiastical complexes. Nearby, the remains of guest rooms or a small hostel were identified, pointing to the site's accommodation of visitors. These ancillary structures align with historical descriptions of pilgrimage routes.
Archaeologists said the church was part of a larger complex that also served as a road station for pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem.
And the facilities required to support spiritual travelers, particularly in sites tied to apostolic memory. The presence of such infrastructure reinforces the notion that this church functioned as a commemorative and pastoral center. In late antiquity, churches such as this one were built chiefly as pilgrimage centers, notably when they were associated with sites of biblical significance. Its plan and facilities compare closely with other pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land, such as Capernaum or Mount Tabor. The pilgrims of that time did not just come for such spiritual experience, but most often traveled to approach the holy as where apostles walked through praying in places where tradition claimed divine acts had occurred. The churches, therefore, had two functions: as sacred liturgical space and as equipped logistical centers for rest, bathing, and spiritual reflection. The El Araj Church fits this way into that tradition, thus bolstering this hypothesis that early Christians thought it was built over the putative birthplace of Peter and Andrew. At the lower levels of the church dating to the Byzantine era, archaeologists found the remains of Roman-era foundations and artifacts, such as pottery, fishing implements, and coins. All of them spoke of a continuous multi-era occupation of the site and forged a direct relationship between the first-century village and later the Christian church. This continuity is crucial. It proves that not randomly did the Byzantine builders choose the location. Instead, they placed their church over a sacrosanct site with a developed memory into history. In this way, the church turns out to be both a symbol of dedication and a stratified witness to the passage of centuries. The Willibald account. In the 8th century, a Bavarian bishop named Willibald undertook a pilgrimage to the Holy Land that would be recorded in what is now one of the earliest known Western travel accounts of the region. His journey, chronicled by a nun from the monastery at Heidenheim, offers a rare medieval snapshot of Christian sites and practices centuries after the apostolic era. Among the many places Willibald visited was a location he identified as Bethsaida, the town of Peter and Andrew. There, he reported staying overnight in a church dedicated to both apostles. His account includes references to the church's location near the Sea of Galilee and the presence of accommodations for travelers, details that, at the time, seemed pious but unverifiable. For decades, if not centuries, scholars approached Willibald's testimony with caution, if not outright skepticism. The medieval period was known for blending devotional storytelling with historical recollection, making it difficult to separate legend from fact. Willibald's reference to a church by the water in Bethsaida was often dismissed as either an imaginative reconstruction or an idealized vision shaped by liturgical traditions. Additionally, the uncertain location of Bethsaida itself further complicated his credibility. Without clear archaeological evidence, Willibald's detailed recollections were relegated to the realm of spiritual reflection rather than historical documentation. Nevertheless, the excavations at El Araj have completely upended the assumptions. The Byzantine church uncovered close to the lake complies with several of the core descriptions in Willibald's diary. Near the lake shore, with traces of guest accommodation, and in honor of, or at least partially, dedicated to the Apostle Peter. The mosaic inscription revealed in the Diaconicon calls Peter chief of the apostles and suggests considerable commemorative intention. These markers fit quite well with the Willibald narrative, thereby granting more weight to it. What was once taken as mere veneration seems steeped, in fact, in the very tangible architectural world. This has caused many scholars to rethink the medieval pilgrimage narratives, which have often been regarded as fabrications by the churches. Willibald's itinerary, already considered of somewhat doubtful historical value, is now a probable eyewitness proof of the early Christian site's importance. More generally, it suggests that the early medieval pilgrim may well have had access to oral traditions or even fading communal memories that preserved accurate geographic placement. The rehabilitation of Willibald serves to strengthen the claim for El Araj as biblical Bethsaida, but equally serves as a reminder that ancient pilgrimage literature is more than myth. It can also be memory, awaiting its validation by the dust and stones of history. If one pilgrim's forgotten journal could echo through centuries, imagine what shaped the very ground those pilgrims walked on. Sacred geography. In early Christianity, the concept of spiritual geography played a central role in shaping the physical landscape of worship. Believers did not build churches at random. They constructed them on locations they believed had been touched by divine presence or apostolic history. These places were chosen not because of scientific verification, but because of the spiritual narratives passed down through generations. This geography of faith anchored theological truths in the land itself, transforming memory into monument. Sacred geography was as much about collective belief and reverence as it was about geography in the modern sense. It was a lived map of the Gospels etched into the hills and villages of the Holy Land by the early church. El Araj fits seamlessly into this pattern. Just as the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem marks the traditional site of Jesus' birth, and the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth commemorates the angel Gabriel's message to Mary, the church uncovered at El Araj appears to have been intentionally placed to honor the apostles Peter and Andrew. The newly discovered mosaic dedicating the church to Peter, naming him chief of the apostles, suggests that early Christians recognized this site as deeply significant.
A new find at an archaeological site called Araj has stirred speculation that this is Bethsaida's true location.
Much like the more famous churches in Bethlehem or Jerusalem, the builders of the El Araj church were not simply erecting a house of worship. They were declaring that something holy had happened here. It was a theological claim embedded in architecture. Such locations are often dictated by oral tradition rather than by written memorandum. Story and worship, traveling together with pilgrimage, were early Christians' sacred remembrances. Generations after generations remembered where Jesus walked, where apostles preached, and where miracles happened. Such traditions were not always as precise by modern geography, but they bore immense spiritual significance. Memory, mapless and instrumentless, was the driving force behind shrine, chapel, and church placement. This El Araj church was probably among many not built because archaeologists affirm it as Bethsaida, but because they believed it to be so among the early Christian community. This is in contrast to the present archaeological methodology that relies on using stratigraphy, carbon dating, and the analysis of material culture of history to define its authenticity. Archaeology is, therefore, seen to be concerned with empirical verifications. On the contrary, early Christian builders proved by inherited memory and by giving to such recollections a stone and prayer testimony. This distinction is important for site interpretations such as El Araj. It reminds a person that in these early centuries of Christianity, faith and geography were tangled in somewhat the same fabric, an act of remembrance not based upon proof, but presence. Local honor or universal truth? The inscription found at El Araj, referring to Peter as chief of the apostles and holder of the keys to the heavenly kingdom, offers a striking window into how local Byzantine Christians in Galilee perceived his role. Rather than seeing this as a top-down declaration of universal doctrine, it should be understood as a grassroots expression of faith within a particular cultural and regional context. The language inscribed in the mosaic reflects the veneration held for Peter by the community that built and worshipped in the church. Their elevation of Peter's status likely stemmed from both scriptural reverence and the belief that they were living and worshiping in his very hometown. For them, Peter was not a distant theological figure. He was a native son. In this light, the honorific titles used in the mosaic serve a dual purpose. First, they articulate the community's deep spiritual connection to Peter as a founding figure of the church. Second, they reflect a localized theological emphasis that was common in the Byzantine period. Just as other regions might have highlighted the apostles or saints associated with their geography, Galilean Christians naturally turned to Peter as their central spiritual patron. The inscription can therefore be seen as an affirmation of regional identity and devotion. It was a way for the local church to root its faith in the physical and spiritual legacy of someone it regarded as foundational, not just to Christianity broadly, but to their own historical landscape. Significantly, it must be stated that this mosaic was not a universal theological declaration. There is no evidence supporting the view that the inscription was enacted by an ecumenical council or was meant to be an expression of imperial or ecclesiastical consensus. Unlike those doctrinal acts of church councils, this inscription seems to be the endeavor of a local benefactor, identified in the inscription as Constantine, who is inspired to do so by personal piety and the veneration of his local community. The language is certainly resplendent with theological terminology, but it is not offered here as institutional dogma. It represents the faith of one community, carved as dedication and prayer into stone. This is an important distinction, particularly with regard to assessing the mosaic's significance in the wider history of Christian theology. Viewing the El Araj from this localized perspective implicitly suggests that the mosaic is representative of a community theology. It stands as a snapshot of what early Byzantine Christians in Galilee believed and chose to commemorate. independent of any broader ecclesiastical authority. It reminds us that there has been a great deal of theology outside of that, generated by church councils or imposed by emperors. Those of ordinary believers in villages who expressed their beliefs through art and architecture, cult, and ritual. This mosaic is a faith statement underpinned by local geography, community, and memory, shedding light onto how a certain corner of the early Christian world understood Peter's legacy. Pre-schism legacy. Long before the East-West schism divided Christianity into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, in 1054, the early church maintained a largely united understanding of apostolic authority, with Peter consistently recognized as holding a unique place among the 12. The title Chief of the Apostles, found in the mosaic at El Araj, was not a novel or isolated honorific. Rather, it was part of a widespread ecclesiastical vocabulary used throughout the early Christian world.
They describe the mosaic floor they found as magnificent. It includes grapevines that form medallions in the center, with images of animals, inscriptions, and Christian symbols.
From Rome to Antioch to Constantinople, early Christian writings and liturgies regularly acknowledged Peter's leadership role, emphasizing his confession of Christ, his appointment by Jesus, and his symbolic role as the rock upon which the church was built. The El Araj inscription simply echoes what was already embedded in the church's theological consciousness. The fact that such a title appears in a Greek mosaic in Byzantine Galilee is especially significant. It shows that Peter's primacy was not solely a Western or Latin tradition, but one embraced in the Greek-speaking East as well. In an era when the church was still united, before doctrinal and political disputes fractured its structure, reverence for Peter crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. Writings from Eastern Church fathers like John Chrysostom and Cyril of Jerusalem also referred to Peter with similar reverence, affirming his foundational role in the apostolic community. The mosaic at El Araj, therefore, does not stand alone. It joins a chorus of early Christian expressions that elevated Peter while the church was still whole. Such common honor debunks the misconception that, in Western development associated with papal claims, Peter's headship is understood to be mostly furthered. In the course of time, an understanding of Peter's authority took a different shape in East and West, yet the appreciation of his leadership remained the common ground. Both traditions revered Peter's closeness to Christ, his role during the expansion of the church, and his martyrdom. The El Araj inscription is in line with this wider consensus. It was evident, even in such a Galilean setting, far removed from the Roman episcopate, that early Christians proclaimed Peter's one-of-a-kind designation. This continuity indicates that the primacy of Peter belonged to that ecclesial memory inherited before theological divisions were necessary to define them apart. The mosaic thus forms a rare and precious piece of evidence in ascertaining an ecclesiology memory. It is not a polemical artifact, but a devotional testimony of what Christians anthologized believed concerning Peter. Its existence is in Byzantine Galilee, which suggests that early Christian communities, whether they were in different regions, shared fundamental doctrinal convictions about apostolic authority. The inscription El Araj thus goes beyond the legacy left behind by Peter to a time when the church honored its first shepherd in one voice. Ancient symbolism of authority. In both biblical and ancient cultural contexts, keys have long symbolized authority, control, and trust, particularly in the realm of kingship and governance. This symbolism appears prominently in Isaiah 22:22, where God says of Eliakim, "I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." This verse forms the Old Testament foundation for understanding keys as emblems of royal stewardship, signifying delegated power within a kingdom. The imagery conveys not merely the ability to unlock doors, but the authority to govern access, dictate terms, and represent the will of the sovereign in their absence. To hold the key was to wield kingly trust and to act on behalf of the ruler. This same motif is echoed and expanded upon in the New Testament, particularly in Matthew 16:19, when Jesus speaks directly to Peter, saying, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." The phrasing is not metaphorical. It mirrors the language of dynastic succession seen in Isaiah. In giving Peter the keys, Jesus is portrayed as transferring a unique and symbolic commission. This act is singular. No other disciple is described as receiving keys. While the power to bind and loose appears in Matthew 18:18 and is extended to the larger group of apostles, the keys are exclusively associated with Peter. This differentiation matters, as it implies a particular trust and authority granted to him alone. He or she would keep the keys of old in the ancient worlds, especially among kingdoms and imperial offices. Most likely, this person was a prime minister in that, or at the very least, a chief steward, highest official under kingly authority. This office had much to do with not serving, but operating with the king's granted power in assessments and judgment. Such imagery exists in both scriptural texts due to historical precedent. This view is further supported by the distinction between the power to bind and loose and the possession of keys. While binding and loosing denotes community in regard to teaching and discipline, the keys record rights pertaining only to the opening and closing doors to the kingdom theologians' symbols of divinely sanctioned access. The Araj mosaic aptly captures this precise sense by referring to Peter as the holder of the keys of the heavenly kingdom. When ancient symbols align with modern questions, the line between faith and evidence starts to blur in unexpected ways. Implications for today. The discovery of the mosaic at El Araj carries implications that reach far beyond the boundaries of archaeology. While rooted in stone and soil, the find speaks directly to ongoing theological conversations about church history, apostolic succession, and the legacy of Peter's authority.
Were the mosaics that belonged to a well-known Byzantine church that was, according to Christian tradition, was built over the house of Peter and Andrew.
The mosaic's language, referring to Peter as chief of the apostles and holder of the keys to the heavenly kingdom, does not exist in a vacuum. It echoes long-standing traditions that have shaped Christian understanding of leadership and ecclesiology. For those engaged in debates about the historical basis of the papacy or the early church's structure, this discovery offers material context for ideas previously grounded only in texts. It doesn't resolve every question, but it undeniably adds weight to one side of the conversation by rooting it in physical evidence from the Galilee itself. At the same time, the value of this discovery lies in how it supports theological interpretations without forcing conclusions. Archaeology, by its nature, provides artifacts, architecture, and context. It does not define doctrine or validate belief systems. The El Araj mosaic is not a theological argument. It is an artifact. Yet, its theological language and its connection to early Christian worship reflect what a community once believed deeply enough to embed it in stone. For those exploring questions of apostolic authority, the find offers a window into how Peter's role was perceived in a specific time and place. It confirms that theological ideas, like Peter's primacy, were not merely later inventions, but were already part of Christian consciousness centuries before major church divisions. The very fascinating thing about this finding may be that they can hope to bridge the chasm between faith and historical inquiry. All too often, they are thought to be the opposite of each other. Faith is seen as somehow rooted in the tradition and personal conviction, whereas history is said to rest upon evidence and empirical scrutiny. But in this mosaic, both find their intersection. The Araj inscription is basically a historical object and a theological statement. It proves that what was believed by tradition, scripture, and liturgy has also marked something in the universe. In the end, the discovery at El Araj raises intriguing questions for believers and skeptics alike. How much are our spiritual traditions preserved in ways we have yet to discover? Might other traditions long ago dismissed as either myth or legend find some form of validation below ground? And what does it say when ancient expressions of faith so closely mirror the theological claims that remain a subject of debate even today? If this discovery made you think twice about what history has buried, don't forget to like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more untold stories that bring faith and archaeology face to face. And if you're ready for the next revelation, click the video on your screen now. You won't want to miss what we uncovered next.